So I'm taking a shower one day and I'm thinking about living on Mars as one would naturally do, weird or not. This is probably a pretty weird thought. I was actually thinking about what would it take for me and say my wife as a couple to move to Mars. What would that actually entail from a logistics standpoint and a comfort standpoint? And then one thing that became very clear is that the easier it is for someone to want to go to Mars and to be in Mars, the more people you'll naturally have go to Mars. If you have a place where you can say, hey, listen, a lot of the hardships are not going to be there. Really, it's just going to be really hard labor. Then I think you'll have much more people that are going to be willing to go to that planet. And the main thing that I kept thinking about was, man, that spacesuit is going to be a pain in the ass. I'm going to have to wear this thing all the time when I'm outside. The spaceship is going to be super, super cramped. And the suit seems very prone to be damaged in some way, say with rocks or a tear or something. And there's probably a lot of mobility issues. So doing labor on Mars is going to be very difficult. And then I started thinking about it from a first principles perspective. Do I actually need a suit? And if I don't need a suit, what's required on Mars for me to be able to live there? And naturally, being a nerd, one of the things I find really fun is to sit down and try to crunch some numbers to figure out if this would be a realistic approach to populating Mars. If there was no need for a suit, how much would it cost? And is it actually realistic to try and make that happen so that we can expand the number of people that can go to Mars based on that comfort level? And the Tesla habitat, which is going to be that key thing that's going to remove the need for a spacesuit on Mars, I believe is going to be used on Earth first and then on Mars. So here's what I think about when I think of a habitat. It's some sort of dome or structure where you can see through it, you can see the Martian landscape, but it's obviously going to keep you at the best temperature possible with the right amount of oxygen so you can survive in that place, in that dome, without any fear of dying. Essentially, think of it as a really comfortable place to live on Earth, say, Los Angeles or San Francisco when it's not raining or something like that. Just some place where the temperature is very constant and it's very livable. That's how I'm thinking of this habitat. And the core things we need for this habitat is obviously going to be the steel or some sort of aluminum that's going to keep the structure in place, and then potentially some glass or something like that to fill in those gaps between the structure. And this here might be a crazy idea, but I think the Cybertruck is one of the key components to this thing. I believe the Cybertruck, one of its secondary purposes is to start building out the supply chain for this structure. If you think about it, what are the two primary materials that Cybertruck's going to have? It's going to have a steel, which is going to be very, very durable and apparently very easy to build with. And then the second one is going to be that armored glass. In another way, it's some sort of glass that's going to be super, super hard and super, super protective. That's also going to be able to be made in mass scale. And so for the habitat, I'm assuming that they're going to use the same grade steel and the same grade glass. In essence, the supply chain from each one of these products is going to help the other to lower the costs for either the Cybertruck or the habitat. Essentially, think of it as a way to just get the raw materials as cheaply made as humanly possible. The steel that's used in the Cybertruck is a 300 series steel. It's about 88 cents per pound, and each cubic foot of this material is roughly 500 pounds. So think of a 12 by 12 by 12 box. Sorry, my metric system friends. It's going to be about this big, this high, and this deep, something like that, rough measurements, okay? And I'm assuming that the beams that are going to be used to build this habitat is going to be a 12 by 12 by whatever length those beams are going to be. And of course, these might be built differently so that you have a much better efficiency factor when it comes to how much material you're using versus how much you actually need to prop up. And that might be way too thick and it might be way too heavy for the use case of building a habitat, especially on Mars since it has a much lower gravity factor. But for this exercise, I'm going to assume that thickness and depth, and then the length can be whatever it needs to be to build the actual habitat. For the glass, I'm going to assume a very similar cost to the Model X windshield. The Model X windshield is a very unique shape, which is one-off. It's basically a very specialized glass piece, and it's going to be very expensive. Right or wrong, I'm going to assume the same type of cost structure for the armor glass that the Cybertruck will have, which will also be the glass used in this habitat, which is roughly $1,300 per windshield for that Model X. And if you divide that by the square feet of the windshield, which is roughly 31, you get a cost of about $45 per square foot of glass. And using some rough calculations using Google, I've figured out that about a square foot of glass is roughly 2.5 pounds. Let's go ahead and list those metrics again for the glass and the steel so we have it on the side so you can look at it. Again, these are going to be very important to figure out how much it's going to cost for the total raw materials needed and the cost for getting those materials over to Mars. Next, let's try to figure out how big this habitat is going to be. What's the surface area of that dome? For this exercise, I'm going to assume that the dome is going to cover basically a surface area on the surface of Mars that's going to be roughly equivalent to a block, like say a block at Manhattan or whatever other city you want to pick, which is going to be roughly a square 10th mile. I'm going to assume that in this block, you can fit about 1,000 people. And if we do a really quick math to see how much room each person would get, each person would get roughly 278 square feet to themselves. So that's that 280,000 some odd square feet divided by 1,000 people. So each person essentially gets themselves a pretty nice room, right? Now, realistically, when it comes to resting areas and people where they're going to sleep, I'm assuming these are going to be way smaller. And the rest of that surface area is going to be saved for where people have to build materials or build whatever they need to build for Mars. So realistically, if you use the vertical space from the dome, you can get a lot more than 278 square feet per person. But for this exercise, let's just assume everything's on the ground. Now let's sit down and figure out what the surface area of the dome itself is going to be, that habitat that we're talking about. And for that, we're going to use some formulas that we learned in math class in school. The formula to figure out the surface area of a sphere or a ball is 4 times pi times the radius squared. In this case, the radius of the sphere is going to be half the distance of the block. So we said the block is going to be 1/10 of a mile, which is roughly 528 feet. The radius would be half of that, which in this case is 264 feet. So we take that number, we square it, we times it by pi, and we times it again by 4. And so the surface area of that sphere is roughly 876,000 square feet. But this is for a full sphere. A dome, if you really think about it, it's just going to be half, right? It's going to be the top half of that sphere that's going to be covering the surface. The second half doesn't exist. It's going to be sitting on a surface and you're going to have a sphere basically going over the surface. So the real surface area of our dome is going to be half of that sphere, which is roughly 438,000 square feet. You can make an argument that this is probably going to be a lot less because you don't really need to go that high, right? If your radius for that sphere is going to be 268 some odd feet, then it also means that it's going to be 268 feet tall as well, right? So theoretically, the sphere is probably going to need to be much smaller, but for this use case, let's just assume that they went with a very spherical shape and you have a ton of vertical space to build what maybe they want to have a roller coaster, I don't know, but let's just assume for this exercise that it's going to be a fully spherical shape. So now that we know the surface area of our half sphere or our dome, we can calculate roughly what percentage of the material is going to be steel and what percentage of the material is going to be glass. So for this scenario, I'm going to assume 10% of the material needed to build essentially the structure for the sphere is going to be steel and 90% is going to be glass. And so the steel would cover roughly 44,000 square feet of the sphere, and the glass would cover roughly 394,000 square feet. And now that we know the square footage for these materials, we can extrapolate it out to the weight so we can figure out how many starships we need to get the material from Earth to Mars. Knowing that a cubic foot of steel is roughly 500 pounds, and we're going to retain the 12 by 12 dimension of the thickness of that steel, all we have to do is multiply 500 times the square footage needed of steel. And so 500 pounds times 44,000 square feet is roughly 22 million pounds of steel. And if we do the same for glass, if we take the 2.5 pounds per square foot and we times it by 394,000 square feet, we get roughly 985,000 pounds of glass. This obviously makes sense. Glass is way less dense than steel. And steel in this case, I was surprised, a cubic foot of steel is 500 pounds. It's so freaking dense. It blew my mind when I learned that number, but it's correct. If anybody has a correction on that, please let me know. But from my research, it looked like 500 pounds for about a cubic foot of 300 series steel. Now, here's the fun part. Let's figure out how many starships we need to move that much tonnage from Earth to Mars. Based on some of the figures that Elon has shared in the past and some of the articles that were written, the lower end of the payload that you can send from Earth to Mars is roughly 220,000 pounds. And to figure out what the cost is for these starships to go from Earth to Mars, Elon has been quoted in saying that he wants to charge roughly $500,000 per person, with the assumption that there's going to be roughly 100 people on board. And so this would make each launch of Starship about $15 $50 million. Now, there has been quotes of Elon saying that eventually it's going to be single-digit million, but I'm assuming that's going to be for stuff within Earth or to the moon. Again, if people have data here to correct it, please share it in the comments, but I'm going to assume roughly $50 million per Starship trip from Earth to Mars. If we take the total pounds of steel we need to send, which is roughly 22 million pounds, and we divide it by the payload, which is roughly 220,000 pounds, we get a number that's roughly 100 starships. It's 99.5 starships, which is basically 100 starships. And then for glass, it's 985,000 pounds of glass divided by the 220,000 pounds of payload for the Starship is roughly 4.5 starships, basically 5 starships. And then if you take the people that we need to send there, so we said we're going to have roughly 1,000 people there to live in that habitat, then it's going to be roughly 10 starships. Now that we have all these numbers, we can figure out what the total cost is going to be to send the people and the materials from Earth to Mars to have a dome or a habitat that's going to allow 1,000 people to live there without a suit. Knowing that we have roughly 22 million pounds of steel at 88 cents per pound, that equates to roughly $19 million in material costs for just the steel. It's going to take 100 starships to get that steel to Mars, and we said about $50 million per starship cost. So $50 million per 100 starships is $5 billion in transportation costs to move that steel from Earth to Mars. And if we do the same exact exercise for the glass cost, the raw material cost is going to be roughly $18 million, and it's going to require 5 starships to get there, which is roughly $250 million for transportation. And then lastly, if we add the humans, those 1,000 people going to Mars, that's going to be roughly 500 million. 10 starships times 50 million each. If we add all these numbers up, the total cost of raw materials and people to move from Earth to Mars for a habitat is roughly $5.8 billion. But of course, there's going to be other things that are going to go into this. It's going to be the HVAC, it's going to be the pressurization system. There's going to be a bunch of other things that are going to be part of this habitat. And so what I've done for this, I've added a 20% buffer to cover those costs. You also have to remember that the dome itself includes additional costs for having a perfect half sphere, which is going to be very tall. So theoretically, if they make this shorter, they would save quite a bit of costs from both transportation and raw materials. But let's go ahead and add that 20% buffer anyway. The total cost is going to be roughly $6.9 billion to get to Mars. $6.94 billion to essentially build out an end-to-end system where you can take materials from Earth to Mars to build a habitat with 1,000 people. If you take that $6.9 billion and you divide it by the 1,000 people, the total cost of this entire system that we just talked about, including the cost of moving the people, is going to be roughly $6.9 million per person. And what's super interesting here is that if you compare this to the cost of a spacesuit today that NASA is working on right now, some of the costs that I came up with, and this is where I could use your help, I haven't been able to find a cost that's less than roughly $130 million per suit. And so the crazy thing is, if a suit costs more than $6.9 million per person to make and maintain, a habitat automatically makes economic sense. And so the implications here is that from a per suit perspective, the habitat seems to be much more economical than the current spacesuit solutions. Of course, there's going to be a lot of innovations on this, and this $130 million, it's probably going to go all the way down to 10 million very quickly, just because you'll have some sort of mass-producing supply chain set up for these suits. But again, if we go back and think about how much more convenient it's going to be for people to want to live on Mars or to move to Mars if they had the ability to take the suit off and just live on Mars and work on Mars without having to wear this suit around and always have it on to ensure that they're not going to die outside of the spaceship, then a habitat makes perfect sense. If we extrapolate the cost of this habitat per square foot, so if we look at how much it costs per square foot of just the ground without going up any floors whatsoever of just the ground, it's roughly $24,000 per square foot. If we compare this to, say, prime real estate in Hong Kong, which I believe is the most expensive in the world, prime real estate in Hong Kong is roughly $4,700 per square foot. So I don't know if this sounds crazy to you or not, but Mars is only 5 times more expensive, which to me seems like it's not that much more expensive. Of course, Hong Kong is crazy expensive, but 5 times more than Hong Kong to live on Mars? That seems cheap. I might be crazy. Doesn't seem that bad. And if you compare, say, the total cost of that $6.9 billion to essentially build a home for 1,000 people on Mars, let's compare that to the railway system cost in California that they're looking to build, or they're still building, I believe. The quote for that project is $105 billion. $105 billion to build a railway. And with that money, you could build 15 habitats. You could build 15 habitats on Mars. Pretty mind-blowing stuff. It really is. But here's the pretty amazing thing about this whole thing. The habitat could be very well used on Earth right now. Today. If Tesla decided to start building this thing tomorrow, I bet you they would have some sort of market for this thing. Say in areas where the weather gets kind of crazy and people just want to live in perfect weather the whole year. Perhaps people can chip in and build these habitats essentially that are going to cover, you know, like we talked about, a block, essentially, city block, and then they can build whatever they want in those things. Maybe we could use those things to populate Antarctica. 86 to 87% of the total costs of building that habitat on Mars is the transportation of the steel from Earth to Mars. So theoretically, we could start testing this out tomorrow on Earth right now to see if it's going to work. And that's one of my big predictions for Tesla, is I think as Cybertruck gets ramped up and to start tapping into that supply chain, I very well see something like a habitat or some sort of dome structure becoming a product that Tesla will begin to sell on Earth in preparation for Mars. Places like Antarctica and deserts, and I don't know, people that live in North Dakota that hate the winter. I don't know. There are use cases for this thing, and it's very fascinating to think about. But what it really comes down to is that the spacesuit cost, if it's more than $6.9 million per spacesuit, then the habitat makes economic sense from the get-go. And if you're thinking about creating an environment where you want to maximize the amount of people that want to go to Mars, having a habitat is crucial. It's absolutely crucial. And if we're trying to get people there as soon as humanly possible, I think Elon said we're trying to get there by 2028 or 2029, around that time frame. These habitats, we're going to have to start making them in the next couple years, right, on Earth, just to test out the systems, start building the supply chain, things like that. So what do you think about this idea? Do I sound like a crazy person? I'm not going to lie. When I first thought of this, I'm like, man, this is like insane. But when I sat down and did the math and I looked at the cost associated to the spacesuits and just it just seems like a struggle, man. Like, you're gonna have to wear this thing all the time. And of course, you don't want to go. If you're gonna go to Mars, it's not gonna be easy. Obviously, it's not gonna be easy. But that habitat, that dome, is gonna be crucial. It's going to be so freaking important to ensure Mars becomes a self-sustaining civilization. And the sooner we can do that, the faster we'll be able to make that happen. And I'm sure the folks at SpaceX and Tesla have been thinking about this for quite a while. But from an economics perspective, it seems like there's justification to make this happen, especially if those spacesuits are more expensive than that $7 million mark per unit. But please do let me know your ideas. Rip it apart. Rip this whole thing apart. Ideally, what I would love to do is start a discussion about some of the future things that are probably way closer than we think, and how we can come together as a society to solve these problems. Is there an opportunity for a company to start thinking about building these right here on planet Earth? And if that's the case, could we start building those things on Mars soon thereafter? But ultimately, I'm really looking forward to the discussion that this may spark. What do you think? Let me know what you think. If I'm thinking crazy, tell me. If you think it's a good idea, tell me. If you think it has a ton of gaps, tell me. I don't care. Let's just talk about this. It seems very, very exciting. And to me, it feels like it's much closer than we all think. But if I'm wrong, it's okay too. At least we're thinking about some of the future implications of what could happen here. And I think tapping into the supply chain of the Cybertruck to build this habitat and vice versa is a very Tesla thing to do. And if you're thinking about it from a first principles perspective, and the question becomes, how can I maximize the number of people on Mars? Giving them a comfortable environment like a habitat is a must. And the faster you do it, the more people you'll get on Mars sooner. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support the channel, I have a link to my Patreon in the description below. You can also join my channel by clicking on join right below this video on YouTube, or you can also click on the Athletic Greens special deal that I have in my description, which is a supplement that I use every single morning and I really, really trust. More information for that in the link below. Thank you so much once more, and we'll see you on the next one. Take it easy. Bye-bye.